Well, why don't we go ahead and just get some introductions?
Sure.
Um, so I'm talking to Dan Ritter, son of David Ritter, right?
That's right.
And you guys together work at, you kind of run First Fandom. Why don't you talk a little bit about what First Fandom is?
Yeah, so I want to be clear up front. So the naming is maybe a little misleading. So there is a First Fandom organization, and that is an organization that is separate from First Fandom Experience, which is what David and I work on.
Okay,
First Fandom is run by a gentleman named John L. Coker III.
yeah,
He is a contributor to our project and one of our key historians. But First Fandom is really a organization that full membership to that organization is limited to the first fans of science fiction, and they have a whole bunch of associate members who are, I think, in order to be a associate member of First Fandom, you need to have a demonstrated history with fandom of I think 40 years. So they are really an organization that is built around membership of those types of long-term fans. David could speak to this too a little more, but First Fandom Experience was ideated, I think, in part with John Coker. And we are not a membership organization. We are more just a publisher, really focusing on building, an archive of this material and creating, work that tries to bring the history of it to life. So they're distinct organizations, despite the names being very similar.
okay. And let's talk a little bit. Welcome, David. So glad to have both of you along. So this is the father-son team that put together the book, The Earliest Bradbury, which is a lot of fun. Any devout fan of Bradbury or anyone with just a general interest in the history of science fiction would really love this because it's full of facsimiles of the various, is it zine or zine? I've never been sure how to pronounce it, but
Zine, so fanzine, so like magazine, fanzine,
okay.
so zine, yeah.
So the various zines that Bradbury and Forey Ackerman and those other guys contributed to way back in like the late 1930s and early 40s. I believe the date range is 1937 to 1941. The zines where Bradbury did his earliest amateur publishing. These are hectographed and mimeographed affairs, and the book is just like reprintings of all those early works of his. Very fascinating. So why don't you talk a little bit more about how you put this together?
Sure. So like I would say, it's the happenstance of two things coming together. So for about 2 years, we've been working on early fan history, and we published our first book last year, which was called The Visual History of Science Fiction Fandom, Volume 1, the 1930s. So we have aspirations to do more. And this is a 500-page tome that goes in depth on the origins of organized fandom. Through the process of creating that book, we amassed, I think, a pretty unique collection of fan-created artifacts from that period. So fanzines, art, correspondence between the fans, they wrote to each other relentlessly, as well as all the professional publications, all the science fiction pulp magazines that were published during that time, where they published letters in the editors' columns. They published letters from fans, and that's how a lot of the stuff came together. So in the course of that, we got a hold of a substantial body of the material where Bradbury originally published. So particularly, we have a full run of Imagination, which was the club publication of the Los Angeles Science Fiction League during that period where a lot of his first stuff originally showed up. And then so 2020 is the 100th anniversary of Ray Bradbury's birth. So he was born August 22nd, 1920, and there's a great deal of activity going on in the Bradbury fan community around the centennial. And so it occurred to us that these two things could come together in an interesting way and gave us the unique opportunity to explore a part of his history that really had not been covered before. So we poked at this because Bradbury's been written about extensively. So we looked around and said, has anybody really ever done this before? I think that these early publications are so rare that it's been difficult. Some of them have been republished, but only really in transcription form. So John Eller, who was the director of the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies at the University of Indiana, which is an incredibly cool thing, has in various his scholarly works around Bradbury has republished some of this stuff, but it's never been published in facsimile form, and our collection is by far the most comprehensive. And we were also able to tell the story. So the book is not just a reproduction of fanzines. It retells a historical narrative that really kind of traces 4 years in the life of the author during that period from his age 17 to age 21 when he made his first professional sales.
Yeah. Yeah. And maybe, so this was when he was with something called, was it the LA Science Fiction League at that time? It changed names kind of in there.
That's
And I think
right.
what's really fascinating about that is that there just happened to be a lot of later famous people in this group. I think it's kind of like the way Paris was when you had, Hemingway and Gertrude Stein and those people hanging out together. You have, Ray Bradbury, of course, but also Forey Ackerman and Ray Harryhausen and kind of Heinlein were all just sort of hanging out together. And you guys really bring that to life. It's just a really neat time.
And they reinforced each other. So Bradbury tells the story about, going to Heinlein's house. So Heinlein was a bit older and he hung out with a number of other professional writers at the time. And there were a number of different sort of sub-communities there. So Bradbury talks about standing behind Heinlein and watching him type and feeling honored that he said, and like Bradbury would say, Heinlein is the best science fiction writer ever. So they developed a friendship, and Heinlein actually helped Bradbury place his first professional stories in magazines.
Yeah. And then as far as those original publications go, I think we kind of covered this, our first attempt at an interview. So now, do you own the Run of Imagination, and the rest of these, where did you get a hold of those?
So we have quite a lot of them, and we've been able to acquire them from other collectors over the time. So this is a 15-year effort to really collect this stuff. I would say the collection we have physically in hand is quite comprehensive, but we had, for this work particularly, we had to supplement it significantly with material that we drew from other collectors who were willing to loan us, digital copies to scan stuff for us, and also from university collections. So there are a number of universities out there that have received donations of collections over the years. Some of which are pretty well maintained and indexed, others of which are, you remember the movie, The Raiders of the Lost Ark?
Yeah.
Right? Remember the last scene in that movie where they're wheeling the Ark in a wooden crate into this warehouse, where all you see is boxes forever and ever. So some of these collections are kind of like that. So in corresponding with these universities, we were able to fill the gaps. And I believe what we've come up with is essentially as close to a 100% coverage of everything that Bradbury wrote during that period and was published, and a lot of stuff that was written about him by his fellow fans as well to supplement and provide color. It's as complete probably as it can be at this point.
Yeah. And what are, as far as the originals go, I mean, I'm just thinking, these were mimeographed affairs from almost 100 years ago, like 70 years ago. I mean, what's their overall quality? Are they pretty delicate, or are they, legible, or what are they like?
It varies widely. Yeah, so the good news is that science fiction fans today as well, but back then certainly, are just fanatical collectors, right?
Yeah.
They really are obsessive collectors. And so the good news is that there was a core body of fans, and we're talking, 100 people maybe across the country that were really at that level of reading every single thing that came out and acquiring every single thing. It's very different than it is today, right? Today, if you said, I'm going to try to read all the science fiction there is, it would be tough.
Good luck.
You could.
Yeah.
You could because there were maybe 4 or 5 pulp magazines that came out every month, and there was a bunch of fan material. So if you were diligent, you could pretty much get everything. So some of them did, and some of them saved it, and some of it preserved in their own collections or passed down to universities. So even though most of these runs, there were maybe 50 copies created of each one of these magazines, the level of survival is actually pretty amazing.
Yeah. I mean, Forey Ackerman claimed to have seen every science fiction movie ever made, and that maybe was plausible in his time. There's just too much content nowadays. But
Yeah.
And it's also true. I mean, Bradbury himself was an obsessive collector, and that's very true. I mean, there's something about that mindset that's, the TV show, the Ray Bradbury Theater. I mean, that really was his office that they always showed in the opening credits with the toys and the books everywhere. And yeah.
And they have reproduced that office at the Center for Ray Bradbury Studies, which we hope to visit when things return to normal.
Yeah, I've been there. It's definitely worth visiting.
Oh,
John
cool.
Eller loves to show it off to people. So yeah, fortunately this is a bad time, but yeah, totally.
Yeah.
He would love to show that.
John's been an invaluable collector, a collaborator on this as well. So we wrote him about this this project early on, and kind of almost to ask permission, although we didn't really need permission, but we said, you know, is this something that you think is appropriate? Like, would Ray want these things to be published? Because candidly, you know, they're not at the same level of mastery as his later writing.
Sure.
But it shows flashes of that, and you know, and John was very encouraging, and he helped us with the research and the sourcing of the materials, as did Don Albright. So indirectly through John. So Don was Ray's longtime friend and biographer, and holder of many of his papers, and so we had an opportunity to correspond with him. And also Sam Weller, who was Bradbury's official biographer, who wrote the Ray Bradbury Chronicles, and also collected an amazing set of interviews, this book called Listen to the Echoes. So we had huge resources and collaborators to draw on in this work, and it really, you know, wouldn't have been what it is without the contributions of everybody involved.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, it's a fascinating book, and I recommend it to anyone who's read it. And, you know, what I find really interesting is you do see what he would later become. It's not, you know, up to par, but this is where he wrote his first Martian tale, for example.
Right.
So you really do, you know, there's a lot of amateurs teen stuff in there, but he's also writing for a different audience. I mean, most of the people reading this stuff already knew him, and so you kind of get a lot of inside jokes and puns and all that. But it is fascinating to read because, you know, you'll see references to people who were not famous yet that would later become famous. You know, there's passing references to guys like Forey Ackerman, and I'm not sure if it's in, did you guys republish the Futura Fantasia stuff, or was that?
So we refer to it, and we made a conscious choice to not fully reproduce it because it was actually reprinted by Bradbury in collaboration with a couple of other publishers in 2007. So there's a beautiful only volume out there. It's limited edition, but you can still get it.
Yeah.
And that material is pretty well out there. So we didn't want to take anything away from any of the other folks that have been, you know, trying to preserve his legacy.
Okay, great. Well, it's a great book, and you guys did an excellent job. And do you have anything on the stove for the future, or is there anything else coming down the pipeline?
Yeah, well, I'd love for Daniel to talk about his involvement in the project a little bit, and also I think he can give you a sense of the various projects that we're considering going forward in the future. So Daniel is the managing editor of the project, and
Sure.
has been essentially responsible for driving the operation and a lot of the content, and you know, is a co-author on the book. So, and it's an explicit attempt on our parts on this project to bridge the gap between the older fans and the history of the genre, and really the younger folks out there, the young whippersnappers. And that's, you know, you see in the books, for example, these narrative comic sections that illustrate you know, parts of Bradbury's life. You see that in the visual history as well. So we're attempting to reach folks like Daniel and get them involved in this history so that you know, it stays relevant. So I'd love for Daniel to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so David is the principal author of most of this material, and he has been collecting it for a very long time, and has very, you know, a more robust and in-depth historical knowledge than I would say I would. When I came into this project, I did not know really anything about the history of science fiction, let alone the history of science fiction fandom in particular. I had been a reader for a long time. I read science fiction voraciously, and I had read a lot of these authors. I had grown up reading Ray Bradbury's professional works. I remember The Illustrated Man very vividly because I had stared at the cover of that book for years as a child, being intimidated by it, before I finally had the bravery to crack it open and be like, okay, what's actually inside this work? So yeah, when I came to this, it was, you know, I think a crash course in history and understanding kind of the origins of who put together, you know, this genre of writing that is incredibly important and powerful. My role with the project, I try to help as much as I can with the history, and I've produced some sections for some of the books, and I read everything David writes and try to weigh in where I can. I help work with the designers that really laid this work out for us in a way that brought it to life in a fashion that we wouldn't have been able to ourselves. When we draft this, we're focused very much on trying to get the history correct, on trying to make sure we're placing all of the artifacts in a way that is compelling and organized. But we literally produce PowerPoint slides that are not aesthetic in any real way. And I think one of the powerful translations that happens when it goes through the design process is it becomes a really a visual thing that helps tell the story of the history and bring it to life and make it accessible for people. One of the lines that we've used a lot is that, you know, the history of this period has been written about before. People have written about the history of Ray Bradbury. People have written about the history of science fiction, but they haven't presented this material in a visual and narrative way like we have been trying to do. And one of the big reasons we're trying to do that is to make it accessible to people who may not otherwise engage with the content. There is a group of people out there who will consume every history of Ray Bradbury simply because they love Ray Bradbury so much. And this work is absolutely appropriate for them. But what we're really trying to do is also access people who maybe know nothing about who Ray Bradbury was before he started publishing his professional work, or have only read, you know, Fahrenheit 451 because that's what many of us were required to read in school. That's, you know, that's something of a challenge. But I think it's something that we've had a good amount of success doing, and it's honestly a challenge that I think is very invigorating to engage in, because it follows kind of the arc of my own story with the engagement with this content. I had read Ray Bradbury, and in my head, he's this guy who clearly was like a brooding genius sitting in a basement and must have, you know, been surrounded by like melancholy and like dark atmospheres. But you read about the history of him and you learn who he was as a teenager and who he was as an individual throughout his life that I had no idea of before. And he's a very different person, and it adds color and depth and context to who he was as a historical person, all of the authors and you know, all the other famous fans that you mentioned that he interacted with, and to the work that he produced itself, knowing who he was as a person and what he was like, you know, the author behind the work. Yeah, so I wanted to make sure that we got a plug in there that, you know, the design work that's done by this design team, they call themselves Tabula Rasa, and they really have helped bring this story to life in a visual and engaging way. And we also work with a couple of really great artists like Mark Wheatley, who has done a lot of the illustrated sections within the Earliest Bradbury and the visual history. The covers of the books are done by Mark Wheatley. Luana the Living, which is one of Ray Bradbury's, I think, most compelling and interesting pieces of fan writing, we gave that piece a illustrated send-up in the book, and that illustration was done, that illustration and layout, here David is showing it on the camera, is done by Mark Wheatley. And this is not how it looked in the fanzines that Ray Bradbury published it in, right? This is how we wanted to reinterpret this and kind of revitalize it as it may be, you know, if this were printed today with a modern aesthetic touch, what might it look like? And how can we try to make, you know, this piece of fiction as compelling as possible for people who, you know, people who are engaging with the history.
Yeah, you do, excuse me, sorry, you do have some, sorry, I need some water, some fascinating illustrations in there of Ray Bradbury, and you go in like some illustrations of Clifton's cafeteria and some other things. That really was a really nice touch, because, you know, back in Bradbury's time with the mimeograph, you were pretty limited by the graphics you could do, so you guys really did some amazing work there. It's a beautiful book. It really is fun to look at. It's also very informative, so it's really, really neat. Yeah, I did notice that the really cool illustrations you had throughout the book. So
yeah, there's art in there from Hannes Bach. So Hannes Bach was one of the prominent illustrators of the day and went on to a professional career and was a great friend of Ray Bradbury's. Ray Bradbury actually launched his career by bringing some of his work to the 1939 World Science Fiction Convention in New York and showing it to the editor of Weird Tales magazine, Farnsworth Wright, who immediately bought some of it and started publishing it in Weird Tales. So we were able to get permission to use a whole set of accent art by Hannes Bach throughout the book. So you asked briefly about future projects, and in the art theme, actually, we encourage folks to go to our website, firstfandomexperience.org, altogether, and there's a page on there called Early Fan Art. And so not only were these fans writing about science fiction, they were artists in many cases, and many of them tried to be artists and failed, and some of them tried to be artists and succeeded, and some went on to be actually successful professional illustrators over a longer career. And so one of the things that we are definitely looking at is a volume that collects early fan art. So there's a page on our website that gives you a sample of this. You know, some of it is just cool retro sort of amateur fan art. Some of it is actually really, you know, as with the Bradbury work, it shows flashes of future talent and future capability. So, we're excited to get into that. And there are half a dozen artists that we think people will be interested in reading. And then clearly, since we titled our first book, Visual History of Science Fiction, Volume 1, we feel we're obligated to do a Volume 2, which we believe probably for basically the war years, the World War II years. So the Volume 1 covers up through 1939. So the second volume, which we're going to start work on this year, will cover probably 1940 through 1946.
Okay.
Which when organized fandom resumed after the war. They had their next World Science Fiction Convention after the war in 1946. So those are a couple things that we've got planned.
Yeah. On the art note as well, and what I didn't know, especially, and I think a lot of people didn't know, is Bradbury did some doodles himself when he was a fan. A lot of self-portraits that were, somewhat abstract. I wouldn't call them realistic, and a couple of various small mastheads and stuff for other articles. So I think it kind of speaks to the community and the culture in which Bradbury kind of came up as a fan, where they tried their hands at everything. He participated, he wrote a lot. I think one of the things too that's worth noting is that the Bradbury writing in all these early fan articles, some of them are short stories, many of them are short stories, and in those stories you can see glimpses of the author he would become. But many of them are not short stories. Many of them are just articles or pieces of satire or commentaries on things. They're inside jokes and kind of spoofs on, life as a fan in LA at the time. And they're incredible because they're witty and they're sarcastic and they're ironic, and they're nothing like the professional Bradbury work you would see from his career as a grandmaster.
Yeah. I mean, I say that those zines, I always say they're basically Facebook in print. This was the purpose of a lot. Yeah. I mean, like they were meant to inform fans about the lives of other fans and what was going on. And it's just, people talk about Facebook like it's something new, but it wasn't really. I mean, this is what people used to do. They were kind of like newsletters as well as fiction. And this is where we went and this is what we're doing. And, I love the one where he talks about hanging out with Harryhausen and Ackerman, and they went to the movies together, and it's a really and it's so different today. I mean, now what's going to happen to all these Facebook postings? The print stuff can last indefinitely, but who knows what the future of all these like podcasts and Facebook postings are. So it's really an interesting glimpse into the lives of these people.
Right.
Yeah, definitely. Fair point. Yeah. So the cover of the book, it's interesting. If you look at the cover of the book, this is Mark Wheatley reimagining, if you will, this drawing that Ray Bradbury did for the cover of an.
Maybe hold it up a little bit more. I don't.
Not fair to see. Yeah, I think it's got to get closer to the camera, maybe.
Yeah. Kind of cover it up over your face. Like, I know you can't see then, but a little bit higher. There we go. A little. Yeah, there we go. So, yeah.
Yeah. I think there's a little bit of glare coming off the screen, which is making it hard to see.
Yeah, so you can see this on our website. Actually, so if you go to our website, there's a page there, the Earliest Bradbury. If you just look in the left menu, there's a page there that has a rich sample of the book, a digital sample that you can page through. There's also a trailer video for the book on the site. Editorial comments. We've got some really great feedback from folks. And we're excited to engage with fans who are interested in talking to us about the subject.
Okay, great. Yeah. Well, this was a lot of fun. I was joking before, this two-way communicating isn't quite as cool as Ray Bradbury made it look in his stories, but it's still a lot of fun. So thank you guys, and I'll keep you updated about the video and where I'm going to post it and everything. But this was great. Thank you guys so much.
Absolutely.
Well, congratulations, by the way. I'm definitely looking forward to Volume 2. So,
Excellent.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Have a good day. Yep.
Thanks, Rob.
Yep. Bye-bye.